Hello, on Sitrep this week, the armed forces are getting a pay rise.
As an ex-serving individual who, was serving 3 months ago, this pay award is super. It's the biggest pay award in 22 years.
We will hear much more from the Defence People and Veterans Minister, but we will also check the small print, like increased accommodation charges, and we'll crunch the numbers on what it's actually worth once you account for inflation. Also on Sitrep, Ukraine's first F-16 jets will be joining the war soon, we're told. Mike and I will talk to air power expert Professor Justin Bronk about how much difference they could make. And a difficult but ultimately inspiring story as RAF veteran Liz McConaghy shares the moment that made her.
PTSD is a chapter of my book, it's a chapter of my life, but it doesn't define me going forward. You really can recover from it, and I think I'm better for the experiences that I've had with that. It's led to me being extremely proud of who I am today.
Sitrep with James Hirst and Professor Michael Clarke.
The armed forces are getting an above-inflation pay rise. It seems like a long time since we've been able to say that, Mike.
Yes, and it is important. I mean, all governments say that personnel are the most important part of defence, and then they don't do enough about it because, for all sorts of reasons that we've talked about endlessly on the programme, the heavy metal, the big systems, the big programmes tend to dominate the headlines, and personnel issues are never really top of the agenda. But I have to say that John Healey, who's now the Secretary of State for Defence, spent a long time in opposition saying on the defence brief, we've got to do something much more radical about the personnel issue, about increasing the offer that we give to our service personnel and their enthusiasm to do the job. We've got to make it more attractive and more rewarding. And I mean, we can always do recruitment, but we can't retain. We've got to retain people. So I think this is the beginning of a much greater awareness, certainly for the last 15 years, of the need to address personnel issues much more centrally. We'll see if it lasts, see if it's sustained in the face of budgetary pressures, but it's a good first step.
Well, this pay rise is going to appear in pay packets from September. It's actually backdated to April. The headline figure is a 6% pay rise for most. It's bigger for the newest starters. It's a bit smaller for the most senior officers. And then there are other caveats. Certain specialisms, such as submariners, get an extra increase. There is, though, another side of the coin. Accommodation charges are rising at the same rate of 6% for many, not for all. And then there's the thorny issue of how it is paid for. We will dig into those numbers. We'll do some comparisons. But before we do all that, we did want to give you a chance to hear in detail what the government's thinking on this is. It's also a first chance for us to hear at length from the new Defence People and Veterans Minister, Alistair Carns, who, until a matter of weeks ago, was a colonel in the Royal Marines. Well, after the pay announcement, he spoke exclusively to Sean Greschek Melbourne for Sitrep.
Currently, we live in a pretty fractious world of where defence is absolutely front and centre and a priority for our nation and for Labour. And this pay announcement is fantastic news for all those in defence and indeed those broader within the public sector. We're seeing an increase in pay for those joining from 18,000 up to 25,200. I mean, that's huge and fantastic for those wanting to join the military. Secondly, we're seeing an increase of 6% all the way up to 1 star. And then from 2 star onwards, a 5% increase, which is the biggest pay increase in 22 years. For those within defence, which really just underlines, one, the government's absolute focus on providing the right levels of pay to those in the public sector, but importantly within defence, which is super.
The military, as you say, has generally received smaller pay rises compared to the rest of the public sector. You say obviously it's the highest in 22 years. So taking that into account, don't our armed forces deserve something more like the 22% that you've offered the junior doctors? They've had to take a real terms cut for a very long time, haven't they?
As an ex-serving individual who was serving 3 months ago, this pay award is super. It's the biggest pay award in 22 years. And pretty significant. And I think really, and not to be overlooked, are those now joining the military. That is a significant increase for those that are now that want to start their career in the military. And then as they look forward all the way up to 1 star, 2 star and beyond, it's a significant increase. So I think it's a good news story.
Do you think it should have been? It could have been more. In real terms, how much better off are they?
Well, they're thousands of pounds better off. And also this will be backdated to the 1st of April. So you'll get, the individuals in defence will get a big chunk of pay in September. Everybody can say, hey, we want more. But actually, there's a far broader package within defence as well. They're not just getting a pay rise. They get they get housing, they get food allowance. There's all sorts of different allowances that are wrapped around that. That make the full package from medical to dental care pretty comprehensive in the military. And yes, we're trying to improve some elements of that as well. But as a complete package, it's pretty significant and unlike anywhere else in the public sector.
What's the justification, though? Because within that, you are raising the cost of accommodation. What's the justification on that?
So the reality is accommodation is becoming more expensive. But if you were to relate that to the civilian market, it is far cheaper. And I can tell you from living in married accommodation in the past, there's a very good deal out there, and we're working now with the department to look at how we make that more sustainable and indeed get better quality as well. But that'll take a bit of time to work through the detail.
The last government refused the recommendation to increase it because of the dire state of affairs and accommodation. And of course, it is cheaper. That's part of the offer, though, isn't it, in terms of joining the armed forces? So do you not think, given the dire state of accommodation at the moment, that you should have also decided to pause that increase in accommodation charges?
So everything's got to be balanced. What I would suggest you do is as our team have done, you look at the private pay and rental sector and then compare that to what's provided in the military. And the military do get a good deal. What I would say is that we are working absolutely as hard as we can to improve the availability and the standard of accommodation. And over the next 6 to 12 months, you'll see some announcements coming out of where we're going to look at that and hopefully get a better deal for the military as we move forward.
In terms of the pay deal, when it comes to recruitment and retention, do you feel that this pay rise, above, what the rest of the public sector have got, as you say, do you think it will be enough? Do you think it will make the impact you need it to in order to try and solve that crisis?
My own view, and I say this from my perspective, I never joined the military necessarily related to pay. It's actually a far greater offer about service, adventure, camaraderie, and indeed a fantastic career opportunity in the education and training you get throughout. But this pay rise specifically for those joining makes it financially competitive in the civilian market, which I think is fantastic. And it's far more than in fact anyone's been paid to date when they get off the train and into the gate of whichever military base they're going to. And I think it's fantastic news.
When it comes to the shortage of submariners, take us through what you're offering them, because there's quite a substantial package for them as well after 8 years of service, isn't there?
Yeah, so there's various different packages for different specializations coming out. The reality is submariners do one of the hardest jobs in the military, and I think that's reflected within the pay announcements that we've come out with. I don't know, and I've always said this, and I joke about it every now and again. I don't know anyone else that would go away for 8-9 months at a time, and the service they deliver is absolutely commendable. I've got the greatest respect for the submarine service, and I've worked with them in the past.
What do you hope pay rise will achieve?
So I think there's a couple of things. One, it will make us competitive with the civilian market, specifically for those joining. Two, it's a great signal to defence, both those serving and those wanting to serve, that we value you highly and that you're front and centre of the public sector pay rise.
You've said it's the highest pay increase in 22 years. Generally, each year, when you look at the public sector pay rises, the armed forces gets a little bit less compared to sort of teachers and nurses, etc. This year, that's not the case, as you rightly say. But considering that has been the long-term picture, if you add that up, I'm no mathematician, that means if you look at it in the round, some personnel might be sitting there thinking, if you want to restore the balance, then why didn't you give us more to reflect all of those years where they haven't had as much?
I mean, this is a new government. You've got Labour in now, and we've changed the chapter. We've turned the page, and now we've given a above inflation pay rise to the whole of defence, which is substantial. And it's the biggest in 22 years. What better signal do you want within defence? I think this is, if I was still in defence and I looked up, I'd be pretty pleased with this pay deal in comparison to other public sector elements. And I think it's really good news.
So why was it 6%? Why was it not 10% or 22%? What was the reasoning behind that?
I mean, the Armed Forces Pay Review Body is an independent organisation outside of Defence that have done that review. And, I think this is a fantastic offer for those within the military. And it just demonstrates, from my perspective, Labour's absolutely focus on defence, but also the fact that this government takes the people in defence really, really seriously and wants to reward them adequately.
The Minister for Defence, People and Veterans, Alistair Carns. You can actually see Sean's full interview with him on our website, forcesnews.com. Mike, he points out a couple of times, he's been living it up until recently, but it also means he knows that since 2010, the armed forces, along with many other public sector workers, have repeatedly had their pay frozen or increased below inflation. I mean, in real terms, it's still thousands of pounds less spending power than it was 10, 15 years ago.
Yes, it is. And I think he's been fairly straightforward and honest about the fact that they're doing what they can now, and they'll try and stay on the case, and he will try and stay on the case. It's very obvious when you're listening to Alistair Carns that he's a Royal Marine senior officer, or was until very recently. And so although as a government minister, of course, he has to reflect government policy and he has to talk up the offer that's being made. But I mean, as a former colonel in the Royal Marines, he would have said something different if he didn't believe it. He wouldn't say things he doesn't believe. He doesn't have that integrity that comes with the position that he was in. And you can tell by his tone that he's going to deliver it straight. And what he's saying is he thinks it's a good offer. It may not be quite as fantastic as he says, but he's certainly a good offer. And it is the beginning of a process. I mean, I think that was quite an impressive interview, actually. And I hadn't heard it until now, but I enjoyed listening to that. Although he had to repeat himself quite a lot, as government ministers always do, he convinced me that he means what he says. And if he stays in the job, he will make a difference.
I'm going to add some footnotes to what he said and also to what Sean said to an extent. So as he rightly points out, the increase for new starters and people in the very earliest part of their career is more than that 6%. That bigger increase did actually already come into effect last April under the last government. That was to meet national living wage rules. Interesting one on accommodation. What he didn't point out is, yes, accommodation charges are going up by 6%, but if it's in single living accommodation, that's only for the best for grade 1. If it's grade 2, it goes up by 4%, it only goes up by 2% for grade 3, and there's no increase if your single living accommodation is rated grade 4. So there is some acknowledgement there of the state of accommodation. And it's interesting to hear, isn't it, Mike, that he's saying, within 12 months, there are going to be some announcements. I just did I'm a bit of a numbers guy. You're stronger on the words, Mike. I'm stronger on the numbers. So I looked at the salary for other ranks 4, so corporal or leading rate, which I think is a good example, make up about 16% of the armed forces. So the base starting salary under this pay rise, your experience may vary depending on allowances and experience, but base starting salary is 37,861. That's up in numerical terms about £2,140 on last year, but because inflation was 3%, it's up 1,070 in terms of spending power. So it is an increase in spending power, and I think looking at the numbers, that is the first time we have seen an increase in spending power for the armed forces from their pay packets in I can't remember how long. I mean, I guess you have to go back to before the financial crisis of 2010. The other thing that came up in that interview, Mike, which I think is really important, is the part this all plays in recruitment and retention. And we had the Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey just a few weeks ago. Satisfaction with pay is at its lowest level reported, it's 32% say they're satisfied with pay. It was at that figure last year as well, so it's stabilised there. Back in 2010, it was up at 52%. I mean, I just wonder, Mike, it's a 3% increase above inflation. How much difference can that make to those retention pressures?
I mean, that's the problem. And it isn't only pay with retention, it's lots of other things as well, like, education for children and family life, accommodation, and so on. We've talked about them a lot. I mean, I think it's interesting that when that satisfaction level was at 52%, that was 2010. And as you say, that was just the beginning of the financial crisis. The crisis began in 2008. By 2010, that crisis was really cutting into public expenditure. And so that was a bit of a high point where 52% of those polls said that they were satisfied with pay rates. Now it's stabilized only at 32%. So it's 1 in 3 are satisfied, and they've got to work to get that up. It's not so much an issue for recruitment because I think, as Alistair Carns said, people don't join really for the pay, but they decide whether to stay in or not for a full term, as it were, or whether to make a longer career in the military. And that depends largely on pay as well as some other things as well. But I don't think, pay is not significant in recruitment, but it's very significant in retention. And so they've got to get that satisfaction figure up over the next couple of years, at least back towards 50% where it was over 10 years ago.
And then the question of how to pay for it. Defence spent almost £11 billion on service personnel last year. Now, not all of that is salaries, but it gives us an idea of the ballpark. This increase in pay is going to cost hundreds of millions more. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, says much of that across the public sector is going to have to come from existing budgets.
Yeah, it is. And they are going to have to look at what they can chop in the budgets. And there might be some big tickets items that have got to be chopped. And that will...
Really? You think big ticket items could pay for this?
They might. They're going to have to look at them. I mean, I think the MOD has gone as far as it can go by cutting here and there and going for efficiencies, which we know are just... there's not really ways of becoming more efficient without more cuts. They're a euphemism for cuts, usually efficiencies. And I think if they're going to reprioritise the defence budget towards personnel issues in the longer run, they've got to consider which big ticket items either might be cut altogether or which might be trimmed back in some significant ways. I don't want to put the mouth on any given big ticket item, so I don't want to talk about individual ones now and start hairs running. But when you look at what they're facing in MOD, something has got to give if they're going to make these figures for personnel increases stick and be sustained over the course of the next Parliament, let's say, the next 5 years. I mean,
Rachel Reeves sort of gave a little bit more detail. She's asking departments to stop non-essential spending on consultancy and government communications, looking for 2% savings in back office costs. In the MOD, is that going to provide much of it?
You can do a certain amount of that, but I mean, most of that's been done already. The problem is when MOD, like all departments, when it's restricted in the things it's allowed to do, it then outsources the things it thinks it wants to do to consultants. And so a lot of peripheral things may stop. And I think we'll see far less spent on communications, probably on defence diplomacy, as it used to be called. We may see a tightening of all that, the sort of things that those of us interested in soft power always think are quite important, are nevertheless, in the difficult times, those are the things that you feel as if you can cut without the front line suffering too much. So I think we may see some tightening there, but that will make a structural difference to the budget, but it might buy a bit of time.
Well, next, it's time, I think, to take stock on the war in Ukraine. Now, we have been seeing occasional reports about specific strikes, including a major wave of drone attacks repelled recently. We've seen discussion of political and military support, but the events of the war and the big picture on the grounds have largely disappeared from the headlines, certainly in the UK in recent months. It is tempting to assume that means nothing major has changed on the ground. We know the dangers of assumptions, though. What is the big picture right now, Mike?
Well, I think there's two things to be aware of in strategic big picture perspectives. One is how the Ukrainians can exploit their victory, as it were, in the western part of the Black Sea, and the fact that they've got Crimea certainly nervous. They've shown that they can attack Crimea, and I suspect that they'll do quite a lot more of that over the period of the summer. They'll do whatever they can, particularly, I think, against the Kerch Bridge, if they get a chance to get to it again with all the defences that have now been put there. But that's one big picture. What will they do there? The other big picture is what the Russians are doing. The Russians seem to be determined to try to consolidate the whole of the Donbass region before this fighting season gets much more difficult with the bad weather in October, November. And the two places that really matter are Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Now, they've tried to take those two cities from the north, from Lyman. They failed. They tried to take Bakhmut as a stepping stone. That was never going to work. From the east, so they're not going to be able to do that. But they are pushing now from the south. It's further from the south to get to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, but they're pushing quite hard at Pokrovsk and Novopokrovsk and Konstantinivka. And if they can take these places, then, although it's a bit of a slog up the railway and the road, they can then get towards Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, perhaps in a couple of months. That's obviously what they hope. Now, I don't think they can do that, but it looks as if while the Ukrainians are going to try and pressure the Russians in Crimea, the Russians are making a fairly determined effort to try to grab the whole of the Donbass before the winter. As I say, I don't think they'll succeed, but I think we will see a lot more fighting because they are making progress at about 1 kilometre a day, and they're paying the price of at least 1,200 casualties, deaths and serious injuries every day for that progress that they make. And so as long as neither side has real air power, and although the Russians have the edge, they don't have real superiority, we're not going to see that much difference, I think, on the ground. But next year may be a different situation as both sides try to ramp up their air power that they will apply to the war on the front lines.
Well, as you mentioned, air power, one potentially significant development, at least in the long term, is the arrival of F-16 fighter jets, wings for freedom, as President Zelensky called them when he was appealing, 18 months ago, for their donation. We're hearing the first delivery is imminent. Ukraine's ambassador to the US is saying those F-16s will be part of the fight by the end of this year. Well, we can bring in Professor Justin Bronk, Senior Research Fellow for Air Power and Technology at the defence think tank RUSI. Justin, welcome back to Sitrep. First of all, do we know how many F-16s Ukraine is going to be getting this year? And just as perhaps more importantly, what weapons they're going to have to use?
Well, the official numbers are still classified, but the discussions that have happened from well-placed sources and from senior officers indicate no more than 20 at the most airframes in Ukraine by the end of the year. And discussions around the first cohort of pilots that have been certified as combat ready being potentially 6, up to potentially 10. We're talking about less than a squadron by most country standards. And this, I suspect, will be very much the initial, almost field test of these systems in Ukrainian service, because with the scale of the fighting, the size of the front, and of course the size of the Russian aerospace forces, which still operate more than 350 modern combat aircraft, and that's within a much, much larger, old, mostly defunct fleet. This small number of F-16s is very unlikely to make a strategic difference at this stage. So I think this should be seen in a similar vein to initial deliveries of main battle tanks last year. It's a crucial part of the long-term and medium-term plans to keep Ukraine viable, keep its forces viable on a sustainable footing. And as part of that, they have to transition to Western aircraft. But it's not going to be some sort of sudden magic wonder weapon that gives them air superiority. And there will be challenges with adapting it to Ukraine's relatively dispersed model of operation.
Yes, I was going to mention this model of operation because they've used this dispersed model, haven't they? Having planes and moving them around to keep them protected while they're sat on the ground to make it harder for Russia to strike them. Why is it more difficult for them to do that with F-16s?
There's a couple of aspects. So First and foremost, personnel. Ukraine had decades of experience operating its existing types of fast jets. And those fast jets, being Soviet types, were designed to be very, very easy to maintain, very rugged, and designed so that if something breaks, you essentially send it back to the manufacturer if it seriously breaks. And otherwise, they're very, very reliable to keep on the front line. F-16, like most Western jets, was not designed like that. It's designed to have quite a lot of, when it was originally designed anyway, it was designed to have a lot of quite in-depth maintenance done on the units that it's operating on. The number of personnel initially that Ukraine will have who are trained to required standard to work on these jets and keep them airworthy, with some supervision, I suspect, contracted, that won't be a huge number of people, and therefore there won't be a huge number of bases that they can keep operations going at any given time, because those people will have to be moved around. Secondly, there's the air attributes of the aircraft itself. F-16 was designed to be as lightweight as possible, to give it the best thrust-to-weight ratio possible, to make it a great dogfighter. It's got a very lightweight undercarriage, and also the intake for the single engine is underneath. And the shape of it, the way that the airflow works, it literally kind of hoovers. You can see it it actually creates a sort of little vortex that you can see in certain humidity conditions, sucking up everything that's right on the ground, right in front of it. And so the result of those kind of relatively lightweight construction and the intake and the single engine is you need, firstly, very, very smooth, quite long surfaces if you're taking off with combat loads. So Ukrainian air bases will have to be worked on to bring them up to that standard, which will be both personnel intensive and also quite visible. And then you'll also have to keep them swept, so what you call FOD walks, foreign object debris that could otherwise get sucked into the intakes. It's not high tech, of course the Ukrainians can do it, but it's quite workload and personnel intensive. There are challenges operating dispersed with it.
Mike, Ukraine's ambassador to the US says these planes will be part of the fight this year, and they're going to not want to risk them in the skies. And we hear another appeal about air defence. I mean, what is Ukraine's position in terms of air defence at the moment? How well protected could those F-16s be in operation?
Yeah, I mean, they would have to be protected. And the point is, I think as Justin makes pretty clear, the F-16s they could be part of a longer-term design for the Ukrainian Air Force. But it's not going to win them this war, and it's not going to give them air superiority in this war at the numbers we're talking about and with all of the various limitations. But it may be part of a big re-equipment program over several years that would give the Ukrainians a credible fighter and a multi-role air force. What they need now, and what air superiority now means to them, is far more ground-based air defense. I mean, that's pretty effective if you've got enough of it. So they need the better systems. I mean, at the top end, they've got more Patriot batteries, or are getting more Patriot batteries, but they need more in the mid-level as well. Those sort of batteries that are good enough against aircraft. You don't need the batteries like Patriot that will bring down ballistic missiles. And then you need the smaller stuff as well, like the Gepard, the German system, which is just like, big machine guns or big cannons in effect that can bring down drones fairly effectively. And then a whole suite of electronic countermeasures, because the whole drone war, as it's evolving in Ukraine, this great sort of war below 5,000 feet, that will be conducted much more in the electronic space than in the kinetic space. But in reality, you do both. So what the Ukrainians need for not air superiority, but air operations to help their front line is ground-based air defense. And the Ukrainian Air Force, as a sort of dogfighting air force that can take on the Russian Air Force, that's really some way down the road, I think.
So, Justin, if we take the Ukrainian ambassador at his word, what do you think we might see the F-16s used for in this fight by the end of the year?
Well, it's interesting that on Wednesday we saw claimed footage for the first time of F-16s supposedly flying in Ukraine. Now, in most cases, these images appear to have been manipulated, and some of them definitely fake. But there is a bit of footage that looks to have been filmed inside Ukraine. It comes from Telegram channels, which typically do post raw cell phone footage from Ukraine. So it's possible they've been sent in already in small numbers. in literally this week. But essentially, if that is the case, it'll be very, very early steps. And I think initially what you'll see in terms of missions, regardless of whether they're already there this week or shortly, will be internal, fairly cautious air defense. So being used to attempt to provide more capacity to intercept Shahed 136 or Iran 2 series one-way attack UAVs, go after potentially cruise missile salvos. So providing additional capacity for those ground-based air defenses, which crucially, they don't have enough ammunition for the batteries they have. So having extra capacity in the form of F-16 is potentially quite useful there, albeit if you're using even Sidewinders, AIM-9s, to shoot down Shaheds, that's a fairly expensive way of shooting down Shaheds. I think you'll also see fairly quickly periodic use to deliver standoff glide bombs or harm anti-radiation missiles, just as we've seen the Fencer and Fulcrum fallbacks doing for the past 2 years. It's worth remembering that the Ukrainian armed forces are extremely heavily dominated by the army, and that the Ukrainian Air Force operational tasking still come from ground forces commanders, which means they're probably more likely to be used relatively quickly for things like weapons deliveries, because ground forces commanders want effects on the ground. And also, the Ukrainian Air Force is at least partially run by ground-based air defense operators. A lot of Ukrainian Air Force officers, including very senior officers, are ground-based air defenders, not fast jet pilots. And as a result, what you have is a command system, both in the Air Force and in the wider armed forces, that is not necessarily hugely used to commanding and tasking fast jets, particularly Western ones, in a manner that's a particularly effective use of those fast jets. I mean, to be blunt, it's the same reason why Russian air power, or one of the same reasons Russian air power has lacked so much potential effectiveness over this war, a very heavily ground forces dominated mindset where air is kind of seen as either this defensive shield that launches on warning or essentially an extension of artillery. And it's a really inefficient way of running air power.
Professor Justin Bronk, thank you so much for your time. Now, this week's moment that made me is a difficult listen, and I want to point you straight away to some details of help that is available if you are affected. It's on our website, forcesnews.com/audience support. We wanted to share this story, though, because it is ultimately inspiring. It is about overcoming perhaps the most difficult moment that any person can face. Liz McConaghy served as a crewman on RAF Chinooks for 17 years, but after numerous tours of duty in Afghanistan, she had to leave because of a neck injury. Now, the moment that she has chosen may at first seem surprising. It is when she woke up in hospital after trying to end her own life in 2020. But Liz has been telling Kate Chabot how in that moment she chose to live and how she recovered and now shares lessons from her own experience to help others. But just a reminder, you may find the starting point of Liz's story distressing.
Up until that point, I was a very proud crewman. You know, I joined the military at age 19 and it was all I'd ever wanted to be. So for me, you know, that job in the military wasn't just a job, it was who I was. It was very much the fibres of what made me. So being a Chinook crewman, we're essentially the eyes and ears of the pilots. So the pilots fly the Chinook around and we do all the shop floor, as I call it. I was very lucky, I feel, that I got to go to Iraq twice and then off to Afghanistan on Up Herrick 10 times. That's when I think things started to really ramp up in terms of the kinetic things that I was seeing and witnessing. So being shot at regularly was pretty routine. Part of the MERT, which was the Medical Emergency Response Team, and that's essentially the flying ambulance. You know, we went from picking up vehicle incidents and people falling off buildings to really some quite traumatic injuries, from blast injuries and gunshot wounds and things like that, and multiple casualties, you know, not just British forces. And I've obviously seen many soldiers pay the ultimate price, which did certainly leave its mark.
Tell me about the moment that you have chosen for the moment that made you in August 2020.
So I thought I was okay when I left the military, and I had about a year or so kind of pepper potting between jobs, and I absolutely wanted to continue to make a difference in life. So I found myself working for a great little disabled flying charity down the road from Odeon, where I'd been based, and things in the main seemed okay until lockdown hit in 2020. And when lockdown hit in 2020, the world got very quiet very quickly. And that's when everything in my head started getting very, very noisy. I think I'd used various coping mechanisms for that trauma, such as running was one of them. You know, I kind of could just about run a mile and a half when I joined the RAF. And then I almost became the Forrest Gump of Camp Bastion, because I would just run. You know, after a bad day in Mert, that was how I emptied the bucket. And that coping mechanism was taken away very early on in lockdown. I'd also, you know, kept busy, and that was absolutely, I look back now, I know that was a coping mechanism I was using. And I say lockdown hit and all of that was gone. So I developed insomnia, and that I started to unravel very quickly. And I knew that I was in a really, really dangerous place when one evening I couldn't sleep, and I got my logbook out and I started to look up those casualties from Mert who hadn't made it on the back of my aircraft, and I really humanised them, you know, look up their backstories. And one of the chaps had proposed to his fiancée before he deployed and never made it home. All the red flags really were flying at this point to say that I was not in a good headspace, but I didn't do anything about it. I didn't reach out for help. I didn't want to be that burden to anyone, even though that would have been absolutely fine and everyone would have absolutely helped me. And it continued and gathered pace, and it got so bad that one day in August, 13th of August in 2020, I woke up that morning and just decided that today was going to be my last day on earth, without a single emotion, no emotion attached to that thought or feeling. And at midnight, I sat in the end of my bed and took a huge overdose, and was very lucky that I survived. And I think that moment of trying to end my life is actually where life really began.
And how was it that you survived, thankfully?
So I woke up 2 days later in high dependency unit in Basingstoke Hospital. I didn't actually know where I was at the time. I remember waking up and I could see a clock at the end of the bed, and the clock said 6:30. And it was bright, and I thought it was the next morning. It wasn't. It was actually 2 days later, and the doctors kind of started to give me as much information as they knew, which was I'd been brought in by ambulance and that my heart was okay. That was the main thing they were worried about. But I had no idea. I remember thinking, well, who called an ambulance? You know, who made that phone call? Was it a neighbour? Was it a friend who found me? And it was only subsequently 2 days later, when I was released from hospital, that I was reunited with my phone. And myself and my best friend went through the call log, and it turned out that I'd actually called the Samaritans for 13 seconds. And then straight after that, I'd called 911. I'm not sure why not 999, but I'd called 911 and was on that phone, on that particular phone call for 11 minutes. Phone calls I don't even remember making, but I guess it proves to all of us that actually when you're in the darkest times and you hear people, you know, fighting for their lives at the side of a road traffic accident, when you are fighting for your life, you know, there's a will inside us all to survive, even if it's subconscious will. And that made that phone call that night. And as I say, thankfully, it was those medics that picked me up and saved me.
And Liz, when you woke up, if you don't mind me asking, after taking that overdose, how did you feel? Because your intention when you took it was not to wake up.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And, it's fair to say that whenever I did take the overdose, all I wanted to do was die. And as soon as I came out the other side of that, all I wanted to do was live. And I look back now and think that's how trauma and PTSD can really affect your brain so badly. And I've only learnt this throughout all of my kind of counselling career, which would have been very useful information to have previously. But whenever we put on a uniform, even if you never deployed to war, you stand in a parade square and someone shouts in your face and you're taught not to run away, not to crumble. You're taught to shoot a weapon and not recoil from that fire. And then if you do deploy, you're taught to go to the fight. It's the classic fight or flight response. The lion comes into the room. Most normal people would run out of the room, but we as military are trained to stay and fight. And that overcomes part of your brain, your fight or flight response, which is your normal reasoned thought. And I had been overcoming that reasoned thought process for years and years and years, and essentially pumping different chemicals into my brain to overcome that response. And here, I think, I look back to the day of the overdose and my reasoned thought was just out the window. If you have PTSD or depression, your brain can just trick itself into thinking things aren't true. So when I did come out the other side of it, my overwhelming emotion was, oh my God, I want to survive. And I think, that proves to all of us that, if you ever get to that point, and I really hope anyone watching or listening never gets to the point where I got to, but don't believe your brain. Go and find someone, get hold of someone and tell them how you're feeling, because they will be able to talk that sense into you to know that it's not the case, that your brain is tricking you.
And Liz, so you wake up and you have this overwhelming will to live and to survive, and you'd hit rock bottom. You've been in what you thought was the worst place, but that's where the hard work started.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't an upward trend since then. I feel very lucky that I was a veteran because I went straight into my counselling about a week later, and then I had lots of various different forms of therapy. But it wasn't an upward trend, and I hit another pothole again along the way when it got to remembrance that year. I think remembrance is hard for a lot of us veterans, and funny enough, when I was serving, it never seemed to affect me in the same way as it did suddenly whenever I'd left. And so I hit another really hard patch in the November, and I had another moment where I thought I could just end this all now. That would be the easiest option. And thankfully recognised those feelings this time and reached out to the doc straight away and was able to get help. And it's something I do. I always tell everyone these days to give their mental health a number, because I think if you give your mental health a number of 10, it's so much easier to meet your friends and say, I'm a 3 out of 10 today. You don't have to tell them why, just say you're a 3 out of 10, but it means that your friends can keep a good eye on you. If you're a 9 out of 10, they don't have to worry about you that week. But it also means that you can monitor your own mental health so much better. And I now always give my mental health a number so I can kind of identify those trends. There is no magic wand to fix it, but with the right love, support, tools and people around you, you can recover. And I always say this, PTSD is a chapter of my book, it's a chapter of my life, but it doesn't define me going forward. You really can recover from it. And I think I'm better for the experiences that I've had with that. It's led to me being extremely proud of who I am today.
And who are you, Liz? How has it changed you?
So I'm a veteran, like I said. I'm a survivor, and I've become a writer, which is one thing I never thought I'd say. And it's always very strange whenever you're introducing people and they ask, what do you do? And it's almost like August 2020 has given me a completely new persona, a new lease of life. And it's helped me find my actual true passion in life, which was writing.
You're also a motivational speaker as well, and you go around also talking about mental health as well. And you have a clothing range. I mean, it's quite a varied career you've developed for yourself.
Yeah, I now do motivational speaking, which has given me that sense of purpose back again and that passion. And I think that's the one thing the military gave me so much of, identity, purpose and passion. And it was the one thing I'd really lost during that kind of in-between time during lockdown. So I've got that back again. And yeah, more recently, I've got a clothing range out as well, which again, people ask me, where do you see yourself in a year's time? And I don't even want to think about that, because I'm really enjoying the excitement and kind of every week changes. And one question I get asked all the time is, what advice would you give your 16-year-old self? And I thought for ages about something really profound. And then I thought, you know what, I wouldn't tell her anything, because I've enjoyed my career so much because it was all so new and exciting and fresh. And, I think that novelty factor kind of got me through a lot of my basic training and escape and evasion training and all the toughest moments of my life in my early career, because it was new and exciting. And if you knew what was coming in life, so many of us wouldn't do the things we do. So, I've got busy. I met a veteran recently, and he said he had a great sentence, which was "get busy living," and I love that saying. I think it's important for us all to get busy living.
Liz McConaghy sharing the moment that made her, and as I mentioned at the start, there are details of help that is available if you need it from our website, forcesnews.com/audience support. Now, before we go, we wanted to take a moment to remember someone who's joined us on Sitrep many times over the years. Kim Sengupta, award-winning war correspondent for The Independent, has died at the age of 68. There are many people in the armed forces who will have crossed paths with him over the years. The list of conflicts where Kim reported from the ground is huge. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the Balkans, the list goes on. Also Northern Ireland. His career stretches that far back. And Mike, I think, among the many tributes, it's really a mark of the man that one of the tributes came from the Ministry of Defence itself, describing Kim as a dedicated and passionate journalist who will be sorely missed by all who work with him.
Yes, and he will. And as you say, a lot of people knew him. A lot of us knew him. And I, when I thought about it, when I heard about his sad death, I thought, gosh, I've met him from Afghanistan to the Reform Club in Pall Mall. We were both members of the Reform, and used to see him quite frequently there. And we always stopped and had a little chat and shared a drink occasionally. And I was with him at an Oxford Union debate. We were on the same side at the Oxford Union, and we had a good laugh that night as well. And Kim used to ring me up as a pundit to say, have you got any comment to make about this, or do you want to say something that I could use? And the thing that struck me about his journalism, he was quite a radical journalist, and he was happy at the Independent. He fitted in there. But he was never put off by an inconvenient fact, inconvenient to him. I mean, he took a fairly radical view of many things, but he always wanted to go that one layer deeper. And if what he found was not conducive to him personally, it didn't matter. He always had that professionalism to take on the inconvenient facts, as well as the facts he sort of expected to be there and that would make for a good story for him. He had great integrity, but more than that, and this doesn't go for all successful journalists, he was a really nice man.
Yeah.
And he went out of his way to say hello to people and to smile at you and have a little joke with you. He wasn't, you got the sense he wanted to be himself. He wasn't always trying to plug ideas into you or get you to say things. He was a nice man to be with.
Yeah, he really was. I mean, I didn't know him as well as you, but, the defence journalism circuit is relatively small pool, and he was somebody to me that always had a smile, would always make a moment to say hello. When journalists are dealing with deadlines and thinking about exclusives, not everybody can be quite so cheery and friendly, can they?
No, they can't, and he managed it. I mean, he was he had a great range of talents, but they weren't always on show. He just did the job, and he was unshowy. And he was this relatively small person, and in a crowd, unless you knew him, you wouldn't pick him out. But he just had that inner quality, both as a person and as a professional journalist. And the MOD are quite right when they say he will be much missed by many of us in the business.
Mike, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our guests as well. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clarke will be back with Kate Chabot for another Sitrep next Thursday. In the meantime, you can always stay up to date with all the latest military stories at our website, forcesnews.com. I'll be back soon. For now, though, from me, James Hirst, thank you for listening. Bye-bye.